Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Before we get started, I want to invite you to come to Unwind, a free drop-in practice session that I'm leading each week on Zoom. It lasts about 30 minutes and just long enough, hopefully, to fit between all your other tasks and to-dos. Each week, I give a brief science-backed tip to help with stress management or well-being enhancement. Then we spend about 15 minutes in a guided relaxation, meditation, or contemplation practice. Lastly, we end with a few minutes for discussion and personal connection. I encourage people to make the session work for themselves, so if you prefer to call in or keep your camera off, that is just fine. You can get more details and sign up to get the Zoom link and call-in information at drkateking.com/unwind. Hope to see you there. Hello, I'm Dr. Kate King.
And I'm Alex Gökçe. In this episode, we talk to Yasemin Isler about healing from grief and loss through mindfulness, compassion, and community.
Yasemin Isler holds a master's degree in Mindfulness Studies. She is a coach and teacher for mindful living across the lifespan. She's a life and grief coach, mindfulness and compassion teacher, an end-of-life doula, and a hospice volunteer. You can get this episode's show notes and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy the show.
We are here with Yasemin Isler.
Hello, Kate and Alex. It's wonderful to be here with both of you. Thanks for having me.
Would you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your work, and what excites and inspires you?
Thank you. So I suppose I could say that I'm a mindfulness and compassion teacher and coach. But I think probably a better way to say it is I'm a facilitator for people to discover how their minds work. Their habits and patterns form the responses and reactions in their lives and how they're approaching their lives and perhaps to awaken to their lives. I teach in classroom settings. I teach MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, corporate-based mindfulness and such. I also work with people one-on-one, coaching in their meditation techniques. And another part that's really near and dear to my heart is grief coaching and end-of-life doula services. And this is interesting because in my previous career, I was a computer engineer, and my practices were really for my own personal purpose. I started practicing about the age of 16 when I visited my sister in Germany. She was a yogi. So I stayed with her for 2 months and I started learning yoga and meditation. And then I came to the United States a few years later and been frequenting Cambridge Insight Meditation Center. Mm-hmm. So practicing insight or vipassana meditation, also known as mindfulness. But what's, I guess, really sort of my second phase of my life is while my practice supported my personal griefs and losses through my life, I think the big one, if I may sort of bring my personal story from the beginning, because it does shape what I'm focusing on right now, is when my husband became quite suddenly ill and died within a matter of 6 weeks. So I right away returned to my practice fully to support myself and my son. And I decided that I want to become a spiritual director. It was just very much a decision. And then I found out about the graduate program at Lesley University here in Cambridge on Mindfulness Studies, which is the only graduate program in the country for mindfulness studies. So I wanted to study my practice from academic perspective and also focus on grief and illness and end of life, which is really what mindfulness and practices are based. How do we relieve the suffering? So that's what I've started focusing on. So while I'm teaching standard programs for general population, my other focus area is how to support the folks who are grieving as well as grieving the loss, death of a loved one. So I do both.
Thank you. And thanks for sharing about your personal journey. I think so many of us are shaped by our life experiences and find our way to a calling through hardship and difficulty. Thank you. I wonder, you mentioned, being interested in grief and bereavement. Could you give us maybe a broad sense of how you think about that topic, how you think about grief?
What a word, right? Grief. It's sort of this heaviness that comes with the word grief, doesn't it? And the word itself implies that this heavy weight on us. And grief is an interesting word because my first exposure to grief was due to death of a loved one, loss related to death. And at the same time, it's a word that really describes any kind of loss. So whether our loss is really due to bereavement, which is, I think, a big part of it, of course. So I will actually answer the second part a little differently, just because I think COVID-19 pandemic also brought something that's really came up to the surface in my grief work as well, which is caregivers and their grief, and the caregivers, whether they're family members caring for their family and loved ones, but also all of the health professionals and everything they're going through. There's just so much grief there that's unprocessed probably. And then the grief of everything, just almost being a human almost brings us to experiencing grief and loss one way or another. And yeah, it could be just because we're born in a wrong place. It could be our color of our skin or our identifications that society doesn't accept. And then there's also the grief of our experiences in life, whether in childhood or adulthood, that really shape us. Relationships. There's a lot of grief in terms of how relationships shift. There's really just so many ways to experience grief that I think honoring any of them is as critical. And just maybe perhaps being sensitive to the nuances that each experience may bring.
I'm curious to follow up a little bit on what you said about grief as it relates to culture or color or various identities. How do you see that?
Yeah, so part of grief, I think, is what we personally experience. And the other part is, I believe there is a part of grief that may not even be easily verbalized and vocalized. And it may be perhaps going deeper to recognize where is that coming from, that in our culture, we may be carrying grief of our generations, ancestors, whether it's our own parents or the entire culture that created how we are living. Perhaps we are very thankful for being, for example, I'm in Massachusetts, and just even a few days ago, experiencing Thanksgiving as a holiday for family and gratitude. It's really hard not to hold also in mind how this country was formed and what it really meant for the land and the previous people who lived on this land. So we may not even recognize sometimes, I think, how our culture may create that weight and heaviness of grief on us. And then, of course, there are other times when it's very much felt because, as an example, obviously, with Black Lives Matter movement and everything that we are experiencing firsthand, watching now more on social media accessible for us, but things that have happened over the course of the last 400 years, what it actually has brought to different parts of our society, that different groups are unfortunately experiencing life in different ways, whether recognized or not. So I think it's very much heavy burden across the society in different ways.
So people who have been in oppressed positions, there's a lot of grief that would need to be processed for them. And perhaps for people who ended up in the oppressor position, then there are issues to realize the suffering that is caused to other people.
Yeah, I think so. I think to be aware of both of them, if that's what you mean, right? And I think somehow allowing more space for example, in the case of African Americans, allowing more space for them to express their grief, I think is also very important. it's interesting because I am in a family that has a little of everything. So I have a part of my family that's sort of white privileged. I myself being from Turkey, I can pass for anything almost. I can easily pass for white, as well as I've been certainly treated as, second class citizen. At the same time, my husband was African. He was actually not African American, but African, raised actually in France. So he had experienced both cultures of France and the United States. So it's really probably someplace we're going that is really more for me as personal as opposed to processing at a social level. But there's absolutely, I think, that weight. And sometimes I think what happens is the privileged may feel guilty. So it may be easier to bypass really turning towards the grief. And I think there are many reasons we may bypass and turn towards grief. So in terms of when I'm working with people who are grieving for whatever reason, it's a way of how do we find a way to allow ourselves with kindness, I think that's where compassion comes into place, and recognizing this may be hard, and to be able to turn towards as opposed to bypass what's happening, so that if we are turning towards it and accepting what's really here, then we can work towards and through it somehow, whatever that may mean individually. And so I think for the privileged, there's definitely that as well.
So then what are things that may get in the way of grief?
So from my perspective, what I'm thinking of is bereavement, really this death that comes in and this loss that can be pretty heavy. And then there could be other griefs of loss and, things going differently than we expect and such. And that can really create heavy grief as well. If I take bereavement as an example, one of the things that seems to be common as I was moving through my grief research and studies and finding what's here so far in bereavement research, and why would mindfulness and compassion, for example, these programs that I have, would help, not just from my perspective, which helped me, but I wanted to really understand why are they helpful, is one part is, for example, the rumination. Not only a part, but one part is because, rumination is more than just our minds wandering. So mindfulness obviously is helping with our mind wandering in terms of becoming aware of it first so that we can redirect our attention, right? But then rumination itself is a kind of a mind wandering that is more on the negative spectrum, where we start moving into negative emotions or past experiences, and we can start sort of staying in that lull space. And before we know it, in the grief process, it may get very comfortable to be in that process. And there may be many reasons for that. One may be that we just need to process the grief. It's a lot of arduous work to process grief. And sometimes we need to be in the midst of it, and perhaps ruminating will help us through that. Other times it may be that we may get into this thing actually away from compassion. One of the reasons I bring in compassion to it is we may almost punish ourselves, perhaps being in a negative way, self-indulgent, not allowing ourselves to give ourselves the permission to heal, to really just more instead stay in that sort of a self-punishing and negative place, because we are so feeling powerless that the event occurred that's now caused our grief, but that we cannot move through this recognition that perhaps this is beyond our control. But we are not as much as we think we are superhumans to control anything, that perhaps we cannot control things. So sometimes rumination may be causes of all of that. So rumination itself, by more mindfulness practice, sometimes allows us to become aware that that's exactly where we are, in that ruminating, very most comfortable space of grief. Is it serving me or is it not, so I can move out of it? And then the other part of being stuck in grief is, I think, this, again, sense of thinking we have more control than we really do. And I think it's also just in our culture, where even in our medical fields, even as we are seeing with COVID, but really with any illness, as well as with aging, where we see these not as part of the human condition, that we are all aging, that we may get ill at any age, and there's death that's associated with being human. We often see these as failures, including even by the medical and healthcare professionals, as well as ourselves. So often we get into this, I think, stuckness, thinking, I didn't do something right. That's the reason there's grief and, there's loss and hence there's grief. So I think those are some of the things that get us stuck. But I think also there's another part of it, not having enough intention to heal. So we need to also to be able to move through grief. And it may not take 3 months, it may take 2 years or even longer. So moving away from the timestamp of how long it needs to take to grieve is also this inner intention, as well as allowing ourselves to want to heal through this process.
That's great, because I've heard many people sort of struggling with this, almost this feeling like if I stop grieving, then the person will be forgotten or something like that. So I need to just sort of stay stuck in my grief in some way, because that's the only way to honor the person. So I love that idea of really setting an intention to heal, and I'm sort of adding that doesn't mean forgetting the person who you've lost, or whatever the loss might be.
Absolutely. You said it beautifully, because I think often it happens where there's a lot of guilt of surviving the loss, that the guilt can easily take us into this negative place, or really sometimes that's all we know. And to be also kind to ourselves, to recognize this is all that I know right now. To be with my grief is to just wallow in the sorrow. And it may take a little bit more of someone else perhaps interfering or just suggesting and getting comfortable with the sense of, I don't have to be in the midst of sorrow 24/7 to honor my loved one who died. I can still honor them. I can absolutely still grieve them. I can absolutely be sad, and to be also, when I'm sad in my grief, mindfully, perhaps I'm feeling even more emotions and more sadness, and that's okay as well. And then to recognize, okay, perhaps there will be other times when I can step out of that and attend to life, because one of the grief models that worked best in my approach, as I was coming with my sort of curated program over the years of everything with my parents' death, my friend's death, as well as my husband's, always was how to be with things as they are. And the model out of Utrecht University, the dual processing model of grief, that allows us both to be able to work with grief, do the grief work, and then oscillate towards being with the new life. And how do we now attend to the new life, the new responsibilities, whether I need to pay bills or attend to new things now, to be able to allow both of those to occur, so that there are times when we still need to wallow in the grief process and be really sad and accept that and move through that, and then take a respite time, and then move into more of, okay, how can I really attend to the practical daily needs now?
It seems fight, flight, freeze reaction gets involved because we're threat of losing something precious.
I think part of it is firstly becoming educated and understanding what those reactions are. To recognize, for example, fight, flight, and freeze, our autonomic nervous system is constantly working. And most of the time, sometimes not at all, or not even aware that that's what's really happening. Because even as we're talking with one another, our nervous systems are on full alert, right? We're still recognizing, is there a danger? Is the door, for example, my door is closed. Is it going to open? Is somebody going to walk in? Am I safe? We're not even recognizing all of these happening. And then, of course, when something like a major loss or trauma happens that we may not even be able to process it, and we may completely freeze. And even up until a few years ago, most people were familiar with fight and flight, and most people were not even aware of freeze, right? So now it's more in the daily, correspondence with one another. We're aware of it now. It's like, oh yeah, that's normal. And I think Stephen Porges had a lot to do with informing us what's really happening in our nervous system. That freeze is really, all of us who watch these animals, even documentaries, right? Like, when the predator actually sort of, gives the killer bite, and we don't even recognize what's happening. And actually that there is something actually good there, where by freezing, the animal is actually helping itself not to feel as much pain, perhaps even, but we may not recognize it. And we may even, I think, often consider freezing as weakness. Right. So I have some personal memories that are just coming towards me, because when our mom died, for example, in terms of our reactions of our 3 sisters were very different. And now that I think about, they were all either freeze or fight or flight. Like, we were all reacting differently, but they were all automatically people who were, for example, freezing sometimes would be just given medicine to just calm, rather than understanding this is what's happening in the reaction and its normal process. Just allow it to perhaps take place for a while. And even, for example, when I teach even, regular mindfulness classes, we'll even get into differentiation, recalling an event even, and noticing how that event is actually registering in our body. So people may not even, for example, recognize in the discomfort of a situation, not even grief, but just a regular situation where they are perhaps heard something that is not comfortable. They find it as a threat. They may start noticing activation of their feet or legs, that because they are ready to either fight or flee. People will start recognizing that sometimes when the situation is too hard, their body is actually urging them to leave the premises or to get into this, fighting, or they don't know what to do. So they just sort of stop and they freeze. So becoming more educated what these responses are, and then to start practicing mindfulness to become aware how it's registering in their bodies, is going to start allowing them to start teasing out what's really happening. How am I responding to things? So I think that does help in terms of informing us.
We know that you've developed a program, Mindfulness, Compassion, and Community for Grief. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what's in that program, what inspired you to develop it.
So what inspired me was these 3 pillars, which I believed were really critical towards the healing and the processing of grief. And again, grief of any kind, right? So from the beginning, I think mindfulness and compassion more recently became known. Even as I was going through my research and my studies, even just until a few years ago, they were just becoming more known. Mindfulness, obviously, thanks to John Kabat-Zinn, for example, became more of a household name. And then even though if you were to talk with him, he will even bring in heartfulness and compassion into the occasion. Because at the end, these 2 elements really are, so in Buddhism, there's a saying that mindfulness and compassion are the 2 wings of the same bird. So we really need both of them to inform one another. And for me, both also my own personal experiences of moving through different types of grief, where compassion always arose as one key element of allowing to experience and being kind to self towards the healing. And then mindfulness as becoming aware and turning towards grief. So acceptance portion of mindfulness becoming really critical, as well as loving awareness, as sometimes it's also called. So those 2 become really critical pillars. So we both need to be aware of what's happening, both in the present moment, as well as this grief experience itself, really inviting it fully rather than pushing it away. Recognizing as one of the key elements of mindfulness, for example, as you know, recognizing that we have this tendency to always want to be with pleasant things and push away unpleasant things, and recognizing even how that's showing up in our grief. And also the other parts of mindfulness, the impermanent nature of things. Obviously, grief, if there's death involved, really front and center reminds us of impermanence of things. But the experience itself of grief is even important to recognize that often grief is talked about as waves. Grief comes in waves, right? And different stages. It's not just one big experience, but it's coming, getting strong. It may die out and then later can come back again. So there's the impermanent nature of any experience. So bringing that also as a strengthening as we work with these practices to recognize I may be really in the depths of a grief wave and it may be really strong, but also to remind myself this too shall pass. And then it'll probably come back again. But at least in the moment, I can deal with just this one experience. I don't have to think that this is going to be forever until the next time. And then bringing compassion as a way of kind, loving way to notice ourselves as a human being experiencing this. So that part of the compassion is recognizing the suffering. The other part is the desire and the wish to alleviate that suffering. And then the part about moving towards sort of in action movement portion of how do I actually now alleviate suffering. So bring those into the elements of how can this help me in my healing? Is there a way that I can act towards that, even maybe in small pieces? So that's where compassion came into play. And the other part is, I think, just as strongly the pillar of community. And community, we are social creatures. We need community at any time. During the process feelings and processing grief, it becomes really important too. And the sense of course, we can rely on our family and friends. And the reality is they may be doing the best that they can, but this may be beyond their capacity. And with so much love and respect for anyone who is a family and a friend, because they're doing their best also to support. But unless they're also educated, for example, even on the differences between empathy and compassion, they may be, for example, stuck in empathetic distress where they're feeling our pain, but they don't know what to do next. So they're really feeling that fatiguing, repeating, just they don't know what to do next to support us. But maybe too much for them to be our helping hands. And communities, of course, do come up. There are support groups for grief, which I've attended many, and both in my personal experience of attending them, as well as just reading around research. There is no golden standard or rules of engagement for support groups. So anybody can start a grief support group. There are no foundations of what would be called a successful of a support group that has efficacy to support everyone in the group. And often support groups end up being more of talk therapy. So rather than going to a therapist, one-on-one, support groups may end up becoming a way where the group one-on-one may start ruminating. And the other part is the dynamics, personal and group dynamics, may allow some people to continue ruminating and others to actually shut down. And to furthermore, and some of the support groups that I've attended that often it even either came up or was even by the facilitator brought up to say, just be aware in the next few days, you may notice some triggers kicking in. So it's normal sometimes for triggers to kick in as we are processing the grief. But often it may fall short of actually offering anything to support the person afterwards. So it may just become more of a talk therapy week after week or every other week. So what I wanted to do was, how do I bring the community support? Bessel van der Kolk talks about people who have experienced similar traumas feel more comfortable in that community even if they are only expressing their traumas and it may be triggering, they still feel more comfortable with it in the community of people who have like similar experiences. So there's that sense of not necessarily talking about the trauma of grief all the time, but also bringing similar experiences and a community of people who can understand one another and share in a different sense. So it was those three pillars that I wanted to bring all together for the support. And the other part is we have to bring in equanimity as one of the foundations. And equanimity is a foundation. If we go into the Buddhist roots, equanimity would be a foundation for both mindfulness and compassion, because I think we've got to really bring that equanimity and respecting what is within our control and outside of our control, and being comfortably, eventually, to be as comfortable as possible to be with what is, and recognizing nothing is just my own doing. Everything has many causes and factors. So bringing the equanimity, bringing again that intention to heal, and bringing this radical acceptance that grief is here and let me work through this. So all of those together form the foundations of the program.
Well, also, it seems as I listen to you that grief almost seems like the tip of the iceberg. So perhaps that's the portal into another kind of reality of realizing, it's really coming to terms with life and death and what we want, what we value.
Exactly. I mean, it's a fast door to awaken through our lives, right? And it may be something that we do kicking and screaming, because who wants to grieve and who wants to experience loss? And when it happens, I think it does really sort of open the doors wide for a while. If we let it in, I think, Alex, you're right on. It does invite so much more recognition of what's really here. And even I think this recognition that we don't day to day think that everything and everyone we love, we're going to not have them forever. So then if we know that, would we live our lives differently? How would we be day to day in our words, in our actions? And of course, it's ideal for all of us to be perfect humans and whatever that means. And we will, of course, return back to our habits. It's not that we will completely shift forever, but at least perhaps to become more and more aware of what's really happening.
Yeah, I know my own experience in end of life work and just my own personal life is that it brings with it, if you let it, it brings with it a rich appreciation and cherishing of life, whatever relationships you currently have or whatever is happening in your present day existence. When you're aware of the finitude of it, you're aware that things end, that then there's just a real savoring and cherishing that at least I can experience.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it reminds me, so this is not something that I came up with. I'm not sure who's the first teacher that came up with it, but I often use it at some point. I think it needs to be done gingerly, depending on what stage of the class or retreat we're in, but eventually lends itself to this reflection of, if I had a year to live, what would be the most important for me? All the way to, if I had a month to live, a week to live, what stays? What becomes the most important? What can I let go of? And if I had a day to live, what really is most important for me to focus on? And it does really have this amazing, I think, process, because often what happens is, I hear from people too, during the process, it may be quite painful in a way, very sad, because even if we are not really dying at that point, it's very easy. Sometimes our minds don't recognize what's real versus what we are imagining. what I hear from people afterwards that, and I have experienced this myself because I remember the very first time doing the practice myself, and it's always never the same. The very first time it was very impactful on me as well, that I really felt it both in my heart, my body, like fully. And it's what I hear often is that as they're moving through the exercise, it's quite almost painful, and they will be crying, and it could be silent tears. And what they say, however, afterwards is that it is almost cleansing, that the tears they shed were very cleansing, that they felt lighter afterwards. Because I think what it's doing is bringing us closer to the essence of what's important. And of course, we'll forget about it in the midst of the day. We'll continue, getting upset about certain things the same way and forget our words. And when we get angry, and I mean, we're humans, right? We're not going to all of a sudden shift completely. But I think that recognition of what's the essence of what's important and how to live our lives, I think it does somehow stay with us. It's a good practice to do once in a while.
I mean, I can imagine it's sort of like turning on the floodlights. And if the person can be guided to stay present, if you can get to the other side of it, I imagine it's incredibly powerful. Really, it's about how to live.
And also kind of what you can live without, right? And that, like, as you're saying, the relief and freedom of, letting this go, letting that go, when by that imagining of the scale of time shrinking, it sort of shrinks the scope of what you carry, to less and less.
What is the structure of the Mindfulness, Compassion, and Community for Grief program?
Things have changed, of course, with COVID and, doing things online. If I were to do the full program, it would be, if you want to get a understanding of the structure, it's a longer program than the ones that we typically offer general public. And the reason for that is grief itself has this slowing down, whether we like it or not. So when there's actually especially acute grief, there is the need for both slowing down, processing things in our own ways, as well as the connection to the community for a longer period of time. So with that in mind, it would last over a period of 16 weeks. Perhaps even longer. I haven't done it for more than 16 weeks, although I have thought about it lasting longer as well. So it's still, there are the structures of gathering together every week, and each week having a theme that slowly introduces practices of mindfulness, compassion, as well as equanimity and acceptance, and eventually towards the end, moving into even forgiveness, meaning making and such. And it's a combination of some teachings, but really a lot more experiential and a lot of time for reflecting and sharing. And what I find useful is allowing each person to bring themselves to what I used to call this grief circles as well. So sort of a circle where we are all equal, so that we can each have our time to be able to share fully, so that everybody can have this balance of both sharing. So there's got to be some talking. So it's not that I'm the only one just telling people what to do. There's need to be a lot of sharing, some inquiry as well, to be able to process in the moment what's happening, as well as having time to do the practices. And then eventually bring these all together. And the other part I find is everybody's different. Some people may be very ambitious to want to do a lot more right away and get very intense, and other people may just be able to do only 10 minutes a day of practice outside of getting together. So allowing whatever is, again, needing to weave into their own life, and just gently telling them, can you do a little bit more, perhaps, if you're only practicing 5 minutes a day? But if they're then practicing a whole hour or 2 hours a day, say, is this really helping you recognize maybe you need to take some breaks? and just finding that balance and really respecting and not pushing anyone to do what they're not comfortable with.
The emphasis on community seems really important and meaningful. I think that as we were talking earlier about places where grief gets stuck, I think sometimes it gets stuck because people don't get to talk or share about it. You know, maybe other people in their family or in their social life kind of feels like get over it or isn't able to provide that space, you know, or the person themselves feels like a risk to share. But having your grief seen and in a way that this is why we come together for all the different rituals of bereavement, I think, too. There's something about that social piece that is actually a really important part of it.
Right. And Gregory Kramer says this beautifully, that we all want to be seen and heard. And then there may be times when things are so overwhelming on our senses that we just want to disappear. And I think with grief, we probably fluctuate between those spectrums, the whole spectrum of wanting to be heard and seen and to tell and express what's really happening in our hearts and minds and in our lives. And then other times saying, I don't want to really say anymore because I'm overburdened. So allowing that space, we need to create the safe space for people to be welcome as they are, not to be judged, and to be able to speak what's really there. And somehow also respect that others may have a different opinion, to be able to encourage constantly each other. My experience may be different than the person next to me, and let's hold everything with lots of loving care and attentiveness.
I think there's also that sense of wanting the person you've lost to be seen and witnessed as well, you know, wanting to share that person's life or their memory or their essence in some way with the world or with people around you.
Yeah, so I do bring that actually a few times through the program because I think it's critical. So opening the program is important to recognize what is the name and the relationship of the person or the event that happened, right? So again, depending on what it is we're grieving, and if the person is comfortable to share, to bring them into this space as soon as we open the space so that we know that they are part of the space. And then throughout the process, to bring their memories, what have they introduced into their lives? What did the relationship mean? Again, with the person or the event even perhaps, right? So what did it mean in the past? What does it mean now? What do you envision it to be in the future? And then to continue bringing them, inviting them so that it becomes also comfortable to keep them alive in ways. One of the things that may happen, especially in the beginning with grieving, people may also be very hesitant to say the names or to mention, either from their perspective, or they may be very conscious that others may not react in a way that is supportive just because, again, they may not be equipped to deal with the loss. So the grieving, I think, also often have this secret desire to always bring what they're grieving, the person, the event, and also feeling very conscious not to introduce it. So there's always this friction or this hesitancy that I think does not make us whole. So this space allows us to be able to constantly bring it in.
So if people have enjoyed this conversation, if they've enjoyed hearing about you and your work and your ideas, where can people find you to get to know you more or study with you more?
The one place they can go to is my website, which is tunedminds.com. So Tuned Minds has a lot of other information besides my grief work, but there is space in there that talks about grief coaching, end-of-life doula services, which we didn't get into today, as well as the courses, and also goes into Grief Circles link, which is griefcircles.com, that is fully dedicated to grief. Right now, there are no other courses currently coming up right away. I'm working on the actual dates for January 2021. And I will have 3 different cohorts based on what I'm noticing. One is grief in general, because I think we all need to process our grief. There's going to be a cohort for that. I'm working on a cohort for caregivers, whether it's family caregivers or healthcare caregivers who are in need. And there's going to be a 3rd cohort for people who are actually in their bereavement, whether it's acute or complicated, prolonged grief, to welcome everyone. So there's a place people can find out about it there.
Great. Thanks so much for your time. This was a great conversation.
It was wonderful. Thank you too.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.